Let's talk more about this. We can speak to the Middle East expert and author of Syria, Neither Bread Nor Freedom, Dr. Alan George, who's on Skype joining us near Montpellier in France, and Dr. Kate Ferguson from the School of History at the University of East Anglia, who's in our central London studios. Thank you both for joining us. I'll start with you, Dr. George. Apart from the obvious fact that President Trump is what's changed since 2013, do you think the wider circumstances have changed dramatically that make military action like this more palatable to some?
Well, the two major changes since 2013 are first, the Assad regime at that point was reeling. It was very, very weak, and it looked like it was close to being overthrown by the rebels. The other big difference is that the Russians are now involved militarily on the side of the Assad regime. And I think that makes intervention, military intervention by the West, that much more difficult.
Dr. Ferguson, do you think Mr. Trump did the right thing?
I think the instinctive reaction is to feel gratified that after 6 years of systematically targeting civilians, the regime is being punished. But whether those airstrikes are genuinely going to contribute to saving more lives on the ground, I think that remains to be seen. And any future military engagement must be accompanied by a very comprehensive strategy that really engages with the diplomatic channels on a very high level, but also sees the challenge in a humanitarian way and a humanitarian framework, because saving lives has to be the primary objective.
On that note, do you think that Mr. Trump does, maybe he's not publicising it, have a broader plan than just a one-off strike? The US government say this is a one-off strike, Dr. Ferguson, but as you alluded to, airstrikes in themselves rarely provide any solution.
It appears that there's not necessarily a very coherent strategy at the moment. I think that there is an opportunity now, after what has been quite a miserable stalemate in the global response to Syria, for the new US administration to draw on the vast expertise that are in the United States, but also around the world. It should use the framework of the Atrocity Prevention Board that President Obama set up, and it should consult with its allies, and the UK there has a role to play, whether in advisory capacity or in simply providing diplomatic support within the United Nations framework. I think that there's space now for the first time for a slightly different kind of conversation.
Dr. George, what have you made of the reaction of the Russians? Dmitry Medvedev saying this morning that we are one step from conflict.
Well, the Russians support the Assad regime. They've made very clear they're going to continue doing that. I think the key point, which Dr. Ferguson mentioned and you mentioned earlier, is whether the Americans actually have a strategy. Regrettably, incoherence has been the hallmark of Trump's period in office so far. Just days ago, he was saying, his administration was saying that Assad was perhaps going to stay in power, was part of the solution. Now that's changed almost in hours. So one doesn't quite know what is the real meaning of these airstrikes. Yes, it's a message and all that, but is it part of a strategy really? Or is it just a one-off which is going to leave nothing changed on the ground? And of course the Assad regime is as brutal as they get. They haven't just been killing and torturing during this civil war, this uprising that started in 2011. That's how this regime has stayed in power. And before Bashar al-Assad, of course, it was his father, Hafiz al-Assad, who established the regime. And I'm afraid, torture and fear have been the basis of this regime from the start. So one really can't expect that it's suddenly going to start negotiating itself out of power. I don't believe that's going to happen.
Dr. Ferguson, should we be concerned about Mr. Trump launching these missile strikes, given the fact that just days earlier his own administration was saying that they weren't going to get involved? It was up to the Syrian people to decide the future of President Assad. And while those pictures that came out after the suspected chemical attack are horrific, and everyone agreed, those seem to be the reason that Mr. Trump has done a 180 and launched missiles.
I actually find it quite difficult to fault the idea that the President of the United States would be motivated by a desire to prevent future atrocities. I think that is not something we should necessarily challenge. And what I hope it means is that there is now a question of what the United States can do. And there was some concern when the new administration came into power that actually there was going to be even more hesitancy from the side of the US with regards to Syria. And perhaps the terrible attack earlier in the week, which is not out of sync with the regime's strategy, but certainly is very shocking to see, maybe will motivate the new president to really try and work towards a solution and commit to that. And that should be supported.
Yeah. And Dr. George, just finally, do you agree with that perhaps it's not a bad thing that the president can change his mind so quickly?
Oh, absolutely. I'm simply saying it remains to be seen whether it really is a change of mind, a change of strategy. There are two broad areas where the Americans, and the British for that matter, could become more deeply involved. One is no-fly zones to prevent the Syrian Air Force operating against rebels, and the other is to support the less extremist groups, armed groups on the ground. There are secular groups, a particularly good one, large one, I should say, a successful one, along the border with Jordan, where the British do have a military presence, and they're already aiding those groups in that area. So safe zones on the ground and no-fly zones are certainly areas to be explored, I think.
Dr. Alan George and Dr. Kate Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate both of your time.